David had always loved living in a quiet neighborhood. The streets were lined with maple trees that turned bright gold in the fall, and in the mornings, he could hear birds singing as he sipped his coffee on the porch. Most of his neighbors were friendly enough, though they mostly kept to themselves, enjoying the calm suburban life. David liked it that way. He wasn't a man who sought attention. After spending years in the Navy, traveling to far-off places, and facing situations most people couldn't even imagine, he valued peace and quiet above anything else. His house was modest, nothing fancy, but it was neat, organized, and secure. Every tool, every piece of furniture, every photograph had its place. David liked order. That wasn't just a habit, it was a way of life. The medals, plaques, and small flags tucked on the shelves told a story of a life that had seen danger, adventure, and discipline. He didn't brag about it. Most people didn't even know about his military background. He liked it that way too. A quiet life suited him perfectly, but recently something had started to change in the neighborhood. A new homeowners association, or HOA, had formed. It wasn't unusual. Lots of neighborhoods had them. But something about this one felt different. The leaders were neighbors who had suddenly gained power and seemed to take it very seriously. Their first actions were small, like putting up rules about garden decorations or the colors of front doors. At first, David didn't think much of it. He had rules of his own and he liked living on his terms. But over the weeks, their letters started to become more intrusive. One afternoon, David found a letter slipped under his door. The paper was official-looking, stamped with the HOA's name, but something about it felt off. It demanded that he surrender certain firearms he owned, claiming that they were illegal according to new HOA rules. The wording was threatening, implying fines, legal action, and community shaming. David read it carefully, noticing how vague it was. No law or regulation was cited. No real authority backed up their demands. He set the letter aside, unmoved. David had learned long ago that fear was a tool used to control people. And he didn't respond to fear. He quietly made a mental note, to observe who was sending these letters and what they were really after. He wasn't about to give up his property to people who had no legal right to it. Over the next few days, the tension in the neighborhood became noticeable. Some neighbors whispered about the new HOA officers and their rules. A few were nervous, worrying that the organization could fine them or confiscate things they had owned for years. David watched quietly, keeping to his routines. He mowed his lawn, watered his garden, and walked his dog in the early mornings, all while keeping a careful eye on the subtle movements of the HOA. Then came the knock on his door. It was a bright afternoon, and David had just returned from a short walk. The man standing there was well-dressed, carrying a clipboard, and had the kind of confident smile that usually meant trouble. "Good afternoon," he said. "We're from the HOA. We need you to hand over certain firearms you have on your property. It's in the community's best interest." David tilted his head slightly, studying the man. He could tell immediately that something was off. The uniform looked cheap, and the paperwork didn't match any standard format he had ever seen. His instincts, honed from years in the Navy, told him this wasn't a legitimate visit, but he didn't show any surprise. Instead, he invited the man in for a conversation. "Have a seat," David said calmly, gesturing to a chair. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't appear threatened. "I'd like to see your identification and the legal documents you're referencing." The man's confident smile faltered. He fumbled with the papers, clearly not expecting resistance. "Well, it's all in the HOA records. You know how these things work. Rules are rules, sir." David leaned back, crossing his arms. "I do know. And I also know that HOAs do not have the legal authority to confiscate personal property without due process. These letters you sent don't cite any law, any ordinance, or any authority beyond your own claims. If you attempt to take my property, it will be considered theft, and I will contact law enforcement immediately." The man's face grew red, and he tried to recover his composure. "We're just trying to protect the community," he said, raising his voice slightly. David remained calm. "And I'm glad you care about the community. But intimidation isn't protection. I suggest you leave before this escalates any further." The man hesitated, then muttered something about coming back with proper authority and left, slamming the door. David stood there for a moment, listening to the fading footsteps before closing the door fully. His heart rate had stayed steady the entire time. He didn't need to show anger or fear to make a point. His calm, controlled demeanor was enough to unsettle someone who thought they could bully him. After the encounter, David didn't panic. He spent the evening reviewing security footage from the cameras around his home and making notes about the man who had visited. He documented every detail, knowing that if the HOA, or whoever they really were, tried something again, he would have evidence ready. His military training had taught him the importance of preparation, patience, and keeping a cool head under pressure. Neighbors began noticing something unusual. They saw the HOA officers walking around, knocking on doors, trying to intimidate people. Some complied out of fear, but David kept his distance from the drama. He didn't need to involve himself in gossip. He preferred observation over action unless action was absolutely necessary. Still, rumors started to spread. People wondered why David wasn't scared, why he didn't seem fazed. David knew the answer, but he didn't share it. The truth was that he had faced far greater threats than a group of overconfident neighbors with fake authority. He had trained to remain calm in life-or-death situations, to assess danger logically, and to act decisively when needed. Nothing about the current situation compared to what he had faced overseas. That night, as he sat alone on his porch, David reflected on how strange life could be. Here he was, a man who had served his country, now being threatened by people who thought they had power over him simply because they had an official-looking clipboard. It was almost laughable if it weren't so serious. The threat to his property was real, but the people behind it clearly underestimated him. That was their mistake, and David knew it. He spent the rest of the evening making small adjustments to his home security, checking locks, reviewing escape routes, and ensuring his cameras were functioning properly. For most people, this might have seemed extreme, but for David, it was normal. Preparation and awareness were habits, not overreactions. By the time he went inside for the night, the neighborhood was quiet again. The maple trees swayed gently in the evening breeze, and the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the street. David's dog lay at his feet, unaware of the tension, content in the safety of home. And David, despite the challenges ahead, felt a sense of calm. He was ready for whatever came next. Little did the fake HOA officers know, they had just walked into the wrong house. And David was no ordinary homeowner. They had no idea that a former Navy SEAL lived behind that quiet front door, someone trained to handle far more dangerous situations than a few overconfident neighbors with letters and threats. The very next morning, David woke to the sound of birds outside his window. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass from the neighbor's yard. On any other day, it would have been peaceful. But today, he couldn't shake the memory of the man at his door yesterday. There was no doubt in David's mind that the HOA officers weren't ordinary people enforcing rules. They were opportunists, trying to bully residents into giving up property. And now that they had seen he wasn't afraid, they would likely return, more confident this time that intimidation might work. David brewed a strong cup of coffee and sat at his kitchen table, going over his plans carefully. In situations like this, patience was key. Rushing in without preparation could turn a simple intimidation attempt into a real confrontation. He reviewed the letters again, noting the vague wording and the way they hinted at consequences without providing any legal authority. Then, he checked the security cameras around the house, making sure every angle was covered. He was meticulous, but not because he was paranoid. It was simply how he had always operated. Training, attention to detail, and preparation had saved his life more times than he could count. And while this situation was nowhere near the danger of combat, it still required the same mindset: awareness, control, and readiness. By mid-morning, David noticed movement outside. 2 men carrying clipboards were walking slowly down the street toward his house. They were dressed in crisp shirts and slacks, their shoes clicking against the pavement. Their expressions were confident, but David had learned long ago how to read people. There was arrogance in the way they moved, the kind of overconfidence that comes from assuming others are weaker or less prepared. David didn't panic. He stayed inside, observing quietly. He knew that the moment he reacted emotionally, they would take it as weakness. He opened his blinds slightly, enough to see them clearly but not enough for them to know he was watching. As they approached his front door, he could hear their voices faintly, muttering about making him comply and setting an example for the neighborhood. When they knocked on the door, David answered calmly, standing tall and relaxed. He didn't yell, he didn't glare, he simply held his ground. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady. "I assume you have your identification and legal paperwork ready?" The men exchanged glances as if surprised that he spoke so confidently. One of them stepped forward. "We're here from the HOA. You need to hand over certain firearms immediately. It's for the safety of everyone in the community," he said, trying to sound authoritative. David listened carefully, his eyes scanning their movements, noting their posture, their tone, their hesitations. "I've reviewed your letters," he said evenly. "They don't cite any legal authority. You cannot take personal property from someone without proper legal backing. If you attempt to enter my home or take anything from here, it will be considered theft, and I will call law enforcement immediately." The men looked uncomfortable, but they weren't ready to leave yet. They had assumed that yesterday's visit had been a warning, that David would comply eventually. They had no idea he was trained to remain calm under pressure, trained to assess threats, and trained to act decisively if necessary. One of the men raised his voice slightly. "We are just trying to protect the community." "You don't want to make this harder than it has to be." David shook his head slowly. "Protecting the community doesn't involve intimidation, threats, or illegal demands. I suggest you leave before this escalates. I am fully capable of defending my home and my rights." There was a pause. The men exchanged nervous glances. It was clear that the calm authority in David's voice, combined with the way he carried himself, was throwing them off. They had expected fear, hesitation, maybe a desperate attempt to reason with them. They hadn't expected someone who was calm, measured, and confident. After a tense moment, the men muttered something about returning with proper authority and left, walking quickly down the street. David watched until they were out of sight, then closed the door and locked it. His pulse was steady. There had been no shouting, no violence, but he felt the rush of adrenaline that came with successfully handling a tense situation. David spent the rest of the morning documenting the encounter. He wrote down everything the men had said, how they had behaved, and the time they had come. He made sure the cameras were recording and positioned to capture any future visits. He also called a local attorney he trusted, explaining the situation and asking for advice on how to protect his property legally. The attorney confirmed David's assessment. The HOA officers had no legal right to demand his firearms, and any attempt to seize them would be illegal. By the afternoon, the neighborhood had started to notice the tension. Neighbors whispered to one another about the aggressive behavior of the HOA officers, but most were too nervous to intervene. Some had already complied with minor demands, hoping it would keep them out of trouble. David remained a quiet observer, not because he didn't care, but because he understood that unnecessary attention could escalate matters. Despite the tension, David didn't isolate himself completely. He walked his dog in the late afternoon, making a point of being seen by the neighborhood. People noticed him walking calmly, greeting others politely. There was no sign of fear, no sign of aggression, just a quiet, confident presence that made it clear he was not someone to be pushed around. That evening, David reviewed his preparations once more. He checked the locks, verified the security system, and even rehearsed potential scenarios in his mind. He didn't expect trouble, but he was ready for it. Preparation had always been the key to handling difficult situations, and he refused to leave anything to chance. As he sat on his porch with his coffee again, the golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the yard, David thought about the nature of fear and power. The HOA officers had believed that fear was enough to make people comply. They assumed that a few official-looking letters and threats would be intimidating, but they had underestimated the value of calm, measured confidence, and experience. David's life had been full of dangerous situations, but none had been about intimidation for personal gain. Every mission, every training exercise, every difficult choice he had made in the Navy had taught him one thing: Panic is the enemy, patience is the ally, and preparation is the weapon. The HOA officers might think they had power, but real power came from control over oneself, control over the situation, and control over one's environment. That night, as he went inside, David felt a quiet satisfaction. He had faced the first real test, and he had passed it without losing composure. He knew the officers might return, perhaps even with more aggressive tactics, but he was ready. They had walked into his world unprepared, and he would continue to be ready for whatever came next. The peaceful neighborhood seemed unchanged from the outside, but behind closed doors a quiet war of wills was beginning. David was calm, focused, and prepared, while the fake HOA officers were unaware that they had provoked someone far more capable than they could imagine. It was a reminder that appearances could be deceiving, and that real strength was often quiet, unseen, and patient. David sat by the window, looking out at the street as the sun disappeared behind the houses. He knew the coming days would bring more challenges, but he also knew that he had the skills, the mindset, and the discipline to handle them. The fake HOA officers might think they could intimidate him, but they had no idea who they were dealing with, and that was exactly how he wanted it. After the first confrontation with the fake HOA officers, David knew it was only a matter of time before they returned. Their arrogance was evident, and they had underestimated him once already. He wasn't about to make that mistake again. The calm morning air felt almost peaceful, but David's mind was sharp and alert. He spent the early hours walking through his home, checking every detail. Locks were inspected, security cameras adjusted, and the small gaps around windows and doors examined. Nothing was left to chance. David understood that preparation was as much mental as it was physical. He sat at his desk with the letters and documents the HOA imposters had sent. Each one was analyzed carefully. He noticed patterns, inconsistencies, and the vague threats that hinted at their true intentions. They had no legal authority to demand his property, and yet they were bold enough to try. Documenting everything would be essential if the situation escalated. He wrote detailed notes, including dates, times, and what had been said during yesterday's visit. While he worked, he thought about the neighborhood itself. Most of the residents were unaware of the situation, trusting the HOA officers to enforce rules. A few whispered nervously about fines or penalties, unsure if they were required to comply. David had always preferred to observe quietly rather than get involved in gossip. He knew people's reactions under pressure revealed a lot, and he was learning more about the community every day. By mid-morning, David had set up additional security measures. He made sure cameras covered all approaches to his house and even added a motion detector near the front porch. The idea wasn't to trap anyone or cause alarm. It was to ensure he had full awareness of anyone coming close. Awareness, he knew, was one of the most powerful forms of control. As the day wore on, David continued his routine. He watered the garden, fed his dog, and even went for a short walk around the block. His calm demeanor served as both a personal reminder to stay grounded and a subtle message to anyone watching that he wasn't afraid. Some neighbors noticed, their curiosity growing. A few nodded politely when they saw him, sensing that there was something different about this quiet, composed man who had refused to be intimidated. In the late afternoon, he noticed a car slowly driving past his house, the driver glancing at the property with visible interest. David recognized the subtle signs of someone sizing up their target, assessing vulnerability. He didn't panic. He simply observed, taking note of the car and its occupants. Every encounter added to his understanding of how these imposters operated. He kept the notes organized, a methodical record that would be invaluable later. David also spent time preparing mentally. He walked through possible scenarios in his mind, visualizing different ways the imposters might approach, different ways they might attempt to force compliance. In each scenario, he considered his options calmly and logically. There was no need for fear or anger, both could cloud judgment. Instead, he relied on his training, which taught him to remain calm under pressure and make decisions based on assessment rather than emotion. Neighbors were starting to talk. Some wondered why David didn't simply comply or pay fines. Others whispered about the confrontation at his door the day before. A few were impressed by his confidence, even if they didn't fully understand the situation. David didn't engage with the gossip. He knew the story would unfold on its own, and his focus remained on preparation and vigilance. By evening, David reviewed the legal advice he had received. His attorney had confirmed that the HOA officers had no authority to demand his firearms, and that any attempt to seize them would be illegal. This confirmation gave him confidence, but he didn't rely solely on legal measures. He understood that human behavior could be unpredictable, and being prepared for every possibility was essential. As darkness fell, the neighborhood lights flickered on, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. David walked his dog one last time before bed, observing the houses, the sidewalks, and the occasional neighbor who waved politely. Everything appeared calm, but he knew that calm could be deceptive. Preparation and awareness were his tools to maintain control, and he used them carefully. Inside his home, David checked the security cameras once more. He reviewed footage from earlier in the day, noting any unusual activity or signs that the imposters were planning their next move. Every detail was important. Even the smallest observation could provide insight into how these officers thought and what they might do next. He made a cup of tea and sat quietly by the window, reflecting on the events of the past day. The imposters had tried to intimidate him, assuming that fear would make him comply. They had underestimated him, and their assumptions had been their weakness. David understood that true power wasn't about aggression or threats. It was about control, preparation, and calmness in the face of uncertainty. The night was quiet, but David didn't let his guard down. He reviewed potential scenarios one more time, imagining different ways the imposters might approach. He considered the legal, psychological, and practical aspects of each possibility. This wasn't paranoia, it was strategy. Being proactive was far more effective than reacting impulsively. As he prepared for bed, David felt a quiet sense of confidence. The neighborhood appeared peaceful, but he knew the imposters might try again. He had the tools, the knowledge, and the mindset to handle whatever came next. Preparation, patience, and calm authority were his strongest defenses, and he intended to use them wisely. David's quiet vigilance paid off. Over the next few days, he continued observing, documenting, and maintaining his routines. The imposters tried minor tactics, knocking on neighbors' doors and sending more letters, but they never approached him again. David had created an invisible barrier of calm authority that they were hesitant to cross. The situation also began to have a subtle effect on the neighborhood. Some residents started noticing the imposters' aggressive tactics and questioned their legitimacy. A few neighbors quietly expressed admiration for David's composure and confidence. While he didn't seek recognition, it was clear that his actions were setting an example. Strength could be quiet, controlled, and effective without aggression. David continued his careful routines. He walked the dog, tended the garden, and kept up with his security checks. His days were calm, but each moment was deliberate. Observation and awareness were constant companions, not burdens. He had learned that small details often revealed larger patterns, and by paying attention, he stayed ahead of potential threats. As the week went on, David reflected on the lessons this situation had reinforced. Intimidation could only go so far. Confidence built on preparation and knowledge was far more powerful than threats, and calmness under pressure often disarmed those who relied on fear to manipulate others. By the end of the week, David felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The imposters had not returned to his door, and his preparations had ensured that he was ready if they did. The neighborhood remained peaceful, at least on the surface, and he continued to live his life with the same quiet discipline that had always guided him. He understood that vigilance didn't mean living in fear. It meant being aware, prepared, and ready to act if necessary. This approach gave him a sense of control and peace that fear could never provide. The imposters might try again, but David was confident that their overconfidence would work against them. Sitting by the window one evening, David watched the street bathed in the soft glow of lamplight. Children played quietly on the sidewalks, neighbors waved politely, and life went on. But David remained alert, aware that appearances could be deceiving. True security came from preparation, calmness, and an understanding of human behavior. He had all three, and he knew it would be enough. David went to bed that night with a sense of readiness and calm. The fake HOA officers had underestimated him once, and he was certain they wouldn't make the same mistake again. But if they did, he would be prepared. Every step, every observation, every detail had been carefully considered. He didn't need to act aggressively or loudly. His quiet authority was more than enough. And as he drifted to sleep, he knew that the days ahead would test his patience and vigilance further. But he was ready. He had faced real threats in far more dangerous situations, and had come through with control and composure. The fake HOA officers were no match for someone who understood preparation, observation, and the power of calm authority. The morning was calm, almost deceptively so. The neighborhood looked the same as it always did, with children riding bikes down the street and neighbors tending to their gardens. But behind the quiet facade, tension lingered in the air. David knew the fake HOA officers would likely return, and this time, they would be more aggressive. They had underestimated him before, and that mistake would not be repeated. David spent the early hours preparing calmly and methodically. He checked his home's security systems, ensuring cameras were recording, and that every blind spot was covered. He walked through the house, making a mental note of every exit and every point where someone could approach. While some might see this as paranoia, David had learned long ago that preparation was the key to control. By being ready, he reduced the chance of surprises and maintained the upper hand. He also gathered all documentation of previous encounters, letters, notes, and video recordings from the security cameras. Every interaction with the HOA imposters had been logged, every threat documented. David knew that if the situation escalated, he needed evidence to protect himself legally. Planning wasn't just about defense, it was about ensuring justice would be on his side if the officers crossed the line. Around mid-morning, the sound of footsteps outside drew David's attention. He looked through the blinds and saw the two men approaching, their faces set with determination. They carried themselves differently this time, moving with the arrogance of people who believed they could intimidate anyone. But David had seen this before. He had faced opponents who relied on confidence rather than skill. Confidence could be broken. Calmness and preparedness could not. David opened the door just enough to speak to them while keeping control of the situation. "Good morning," he said in a steady voice. "I assume you're here to continue our previous discussion." The taller man raised his clipboard, trying to assert authority. "Yes, we need you to hand over the firearms immediately. You've been given warnings, and we cannot allow you to defy the community." David's expression stayed calm. He didn't flinch or raise his voice. "I have already reviewed your previous attempts. You have no legal authority to demand my property. Any attempt to enter my home or seize anything will be considered theft, and law enforcement will be contacted immediately. I suggest you leave now." The imposters exchanged nervous glances, clearly frustrated that their threats were ineffective. They tried again, attempting to pressure him verbally, emphasizing fines, legal action, and supposed community safety. But David remained steady, his eyes calm, his voice measured. The confidence they had relied on was no match for someone trained to stay composed under pressure. "Look, we're just trying to protect everyone," one of them said, his tone beginning to waver. "You don't want this to get out of hand." David shook his head slowly. "Protecting the community doesn't involve breaking the law or threatening residents. I am willing to discuss neighborhood concerns respectfully, but I will not comply with illegal demands. You need to leave before this escalates any further." A tense silence followed. David's calm demeanor and clear understanding of his rights were unnerving them. They had expected resistance, maybe even fear, but not this quiet, controlled authority. Their confidence began to crumble under the weight of his calm presence. Suddenly, David noticed movement from the corner of his eye. A neighbor was walking toward the scene, curious about the confrontation. This was a critical moment. He knew public awareness could work in his favor. He didn't need anyone to intervene, but having witnesses would hold the imposters accountable. "You might want to reconsider," David said, gesturing subtly toward the neighbor. "Actions have consequences, and there are witnesses here." The men hesitated. David's words were calm but firm, carrying a subtle warning. It was clear they hadn't expected him to command the situation without raising his voice, without showing aggression. The psychological advantage had shifted entirely in David's favor. After a few moments, the taller man muttered something about returning with proper authority and turned to leave. But before they could walk away, David spoke again. calmly but with authority that left no room for misinterpretation. Do not come back without legal proof of authority. Any further attempts to intimidate me or take my property will be documented and turned over to law enforcement immediately. Consider this your final warning. The impostors hurried down the street, glancing back nervously. David closed the door and locked it, standing for a moment to let the tension dissipate. He didn't celebrate. There was no need. The victory was quiet but significant. He had maintained control, asserted his rights, and protected his property without confrontation escalating into violence. As the day went on, David remained vigilant. He continued documenting everything, sending copies of the security footage and detailed notes to the attorney he trusted. Each action reinforced his position, building a strong legal defense in case the HOA officers tried anything again. Preparation and foresight were his greatest tools, and he was using them carefully. Neighbors began to notice the change. Whispers circulated about the brave homeowner who had stood up to the overzealous HOA officers. Some were curious, others impressed, and a few were inspired. But David didn't seek attention. He stayed focused on protecting his home and ensuring the situation didn't spiral out of control. His actions were deliberate, measured, and strategic, an example of quiet strength rather than aggression. By evening, David reflected on what had happened. The confrontation had not been violent, but it had been a test of wills. He realized that the imposters had underestimated him from the start, assuming that fear could control him. They had learned, perhaps too late, that true strength comes from preparation, calmness, and the ability to assess a situation logically before acting. David also thought about the importance of maintaining composure under pressure. The fake HOA officers had relied on intimidation, hoping that aggression would force compliance. But he had shown that control and patience were far more effective. It was a lesson that extended beyond this situation, something that applied to every challenge in life. As the neighborhood settled into quiet for the night, David checked his home one last time. All doors were locked, cameras were recording, and his preparations were complete. He made a small cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the street as darkness fell. The world outside appeared calm, but he knew the imposters might try again. And if they did, he would be ready. David didn't dwell on fear or anger. He didn't need to. His confidence was quiet, steady, and grounded in his experience and preparation. He knew that the next visit, should it come, would be met with the same calm authority he had demonstrated today. The imposters had tried to intimidate him, but they had no idea what they were dealing with. He leaned back, taking a deep breath, feeling the satisfaction that came from staying in control when others tried to create chaos. The quiet strength he carried was a shield, and it had protected him so far. The imposters had walked into his world unprepared, and he intended to make sure they didn't make the same mistake twice. By the time he went to bed, David felt a quiet sense of readiness. The neighborhood was peaceful again, children's laughter fading as night fell, but he remained alert. He had faced intimidation, maintained control, and protected what was rightfully his, and he knew that should the HOA imposters return, he would handle it with the same calm confidence and careful planning that had carried him through every challenge before. David's quiet vigilance, his preparation, and his unwavering confidence had turned a potential threat into a clear message. He was not someone to be bullied. The fake HOA officers had learned a valuable lesson today. They had underestimated a man who had lived through far greater challenges, and they had discovered too late that appearances could be deceiving. The street was quiet, the lights of the houses glowing softly, and David sat alone, feeling a sense of calm satisfaction. The confrontation had been resolved without violence, without anger, and without panic. That was the true measure of strength. The imposters might try again, but David was ready for them. Every move he had made was deliberate, calculated, and effective. He had protected his home, his rights, and his peace of mind. And in that quiet moment he realized that sometimes the greatest victories weren't loud or dramatic. They were calm, steady, and unwavering. And today, David had won a victory that mattered far more than intimidation could ever threaten. The morning sunlight streamed through the blinds, painting David's living room with soft gold. The street outside seemed calm, almost as if nothing had ever happened. But David knew better. The events of the past week had left a quiet tension hanging over the neighborhood. The fake HOA officers had tried intimidation, had tried to bully him, and had failed. And while the neighborhood might have seemed peaceful, the lessons learned in those few days were far-reaching. David sat at the kitchen table sipping his coffee, reviewing the notes and video recordings he had carefully gathered over the last few days. Every interaction with the imposters, every knock on the door, every vague threat, everything had been documented. He had gone above and beyond, not because he expected trouble, but because preparation had always been the key to staying in control. In his experience, being ready was the difference between calm resolution and chaos. By late morning, a few neighbors had started to appear outside, talking in small groups. Whispers of curiosity and admiration spread quietly through the street. They had noticed the imposters' behavior and David's unwavering composure. While most had remained on the sidelines, it was clear that people were starting to take notice. David didn't seek attention, but he knew that actions spoke louder than words. His calm confidence had made a subtle yet powerful impression. Then, almost as if on cue, the imposters appeared again. This time they moved with hurried determination, hoping to regain control. They knocked firmly on David's door, expecting to intimidate him with their confident stance. But David was ready. He opened the door, standing tall and composed. "Good morning," he said evenly. "I see you're back. Are you here with legal authority this time?" The taller man's face flushed slightly. "We're just here to ensure compliance," he stammered, clearly uncomfortable. David's eyes remained steady. "Compliance with what? Your previous letters have no legal basis and your threats are documented. If you attempt to enter my property or seize anything, it will be considered theft. I will contact law enforcement immediately. I suggest you leave before this situation escalates further." The imposters exchanged uneasy glances. It was clear that the calm authority in David's voice, combined with the unwavering confidence he displayed, was unsettling them. They had expected fear, hesitation, or confusion, not quiet control. David's preparation and composure had given him the upper hand. Suddenly, a neighbor stepped onto the porch, casually observing the scene. This simple act had a powerful effect. It was a reminder to the imposters that their actions were being watched, that their behavior could be reported, and that they no longer had the freedom to act without accountability. David gestured subtly toward the neighbor. "I would appreciate it if you left now," he said firmly. "Any further attempts to intimidate me will be documented and turned over to the authorities. Consider this your final warning." The imposters hesitated, clearly unnerved. They had never expected such controlled resistance. After a tense moment, muttering about returning with proper authority, they finally turned and walked away. David watched them until they were out of sight, then closed the door and locked it. There was no celebration, no rush of adrenaline, only quiet satisfaction. He had maintained control, protected his property, and reinforced his rights without a single act of aggression. The rest of the day was calm. David continued his routines, walking the dog, tending the garden, checking cameras, and reviewing notes. He took the time to reflect on what had occurred. The imposters had relied on intimidation, hoping to scare him into compliance. But their methods had failed because he had relied on preparation, patience, and calm authority. Fear and aggression were temporary tools. Knowledge, observation, and control were permanent. As word spread through the neighborhood, more residents began to realize what had happened. Some had previously complied with the imposters' minor demands, fearing fines or penalties. Now, seeing David's success, they began questioning the HOA officers' legitimacy. Small conversations formed on sidewalks and driveways, neighbors sharing what they had witnessed and expressing quiet admiration for the calm, composed man who had stood up for his rights. By evening, the imposters' presence had noticeably diminished. Their credibility was weakening, and neighbors started speaking up. Some reported the incidents to local authorities, sharing the documentation David had helped them collect. The imposters had underestimated the power of preparation, patience, and community awareness. David had shown that calm confidence and careful strategy could outweigh threats and intimidation. David spent the night reviewing everything one last time. The recordings, notes, and interactions formed a complete record of the events. Should the imposters try to return, David knew he was legally and practically prepared. But more importantly, he felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. He had faced a challenge not with anger or aggression, but with calmness, patience, and intelligence. The neighborhood, once tense and uncertain, began to settle into a new rhythm. Residents who had once feared the HOA officer's threats felt reassured. They began to understand that rules and authority had limits, and that personal rights could not be violated through intimidation. David had not only protected his own home, but had indirectly helped his neighbors understand the importance of standing firm and knowing their rights. Over the next few days, life returned to a peaceful rhythm. The street looked the same, but the sense of confidence and awareness had shifted subtly. Neighbors greeted each other more openly, sharing stories and small gestures of kindness. The outsider